exiled, forgotten. This was the end of Romanos IV, emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, stripped of his sight, his crown, and his dignity. Once he commanded armies that stretched from the Bosporus to the highlands of Anatolia. Now he stumbled across the stones of a prison island, guided only by the echo of his own footsteps. How does a ruler fall so far and so fast? It began with a single day in 1071, a day when the empire's banners stood against the Seljuk Turks on the fields of Manzikert. The enemy was fierce, but the deadliest blow came not from the front, but from behind. The steel that cut deepest was forged in his own court. What followed was not just defeat, but humiliation. A betrayal that would tear open the empire's armor and leave its emperor to bleed in the shadows. And so, to understand the path that led Romanos to that dark room, to that moment where the light itself was stolen from him, we must go back to the man before the crown and the storm that was already gathering around him. He was not born in a palace. His first breath was drawn under the shadow of a frontier where the empire's reach was fading. Romanos IV came from the Anatolian military aristocracy, families who carried scars in place of medals and taught their sons that survival was earned, never granted. From his earliest years, he knew the sound of war before he understood the language of court. The clash of steel, the thud of hooves, the low cries of men standing shoulder to shoulder in the dust. He had seen villages vanish in smoke by dawn and had walked among the ashes where laughter had lived the day before. Perhaps it was there, beneath the unforgiving sun of the East, that he learned the one truth every soldier carves into his heart. Trust is earned in blood. Romanos did not rise because of a famous name. He rose because men who had fought beside him spoke his name with respect. He stood in the same mud they did, his blade drawn, his armor dented not from ceremony but from battle. He was a commander who led from the front, and in war, that made all the difference. But Constantinople was not the frontier. Its walls were higher than any fortress he had seen, and the real battles were fought in corridors lit by candlelight, where words could kill faster than arrows. He stepped into a city where victory belonged not to the strongest arm, but to the sharpest intrigue. When Emperor Constantine X lay dying, the empire's heart trembled. Corruption gnawed at its edges, the Seljuks pressed in from the east, and all eyes turned to the empress, Eudokia Makrembolitissa, guardian of the imperial succession. Romanos met her not as a suitor, but as a soldier returning from the field, a man whose presence filled a room with the gravity of command. For a soldier to become an emperor, sometimes the battlefield shifts, from the plains to the marriage bed. Their union was swift, decisive, and dangerous. Some saw it as the empire's salvation. Others saw it as theft in daylight. The Doukas family, bound to the previous emperor's bloodline, took it as a personal insult, an intrusion into a throne they believed was theirs by right. But their hatred carried a quiet patience, the kind that waits for the perfect moment to strike. Romanos accepted the crown not with the caution of a courtier, but with the certainty of a commander. He wore it like armor, believing that strength and decisiveness could secure both the palace and the borders. Yet in Byzantium, decisiveness could be read as arrogance, and strength as a threat. Beyond the city, the Seljuk threat grew sharper, their raids cutting into the empire's flesh. But inside the city's marble walls, another enemy stirred, one without banners, one that smiled while sharpening the knife. And before Romanos could face the storm outside, the winds within his own court had already begun to shift, carrying the scent of betrayal. The Seljuk Turks did not come like a single storm. They came like the turning of the seasons, slowly at first, then all at once until the land itself seemed to change beneath their feet. Villages on the eastern frontier vanished into silence. Garrisons that had stood for decades now sent desperate calls for help. The empire had faced enemies before, but this was different. The Seljuks were not merely raiders. They were conquerors who intended to stay. Romanos knew war as a soldier knows his own heartbeat. He understood that waiting too long would only invite the enemy deeper, and once they rooted themselves, tearing them out would bleed the empire dry. So he began to push for a campaign, a bold strike into the east to break their advance. But every step toward war was met with resistance in the capital. Gold for the army was tied up in endless debates. Supplies promised for the frontier arrived late or not at all. And while Romanos was still sharpening his blade, the Seljuks were already taking cities the empire once considered untouchable. Some of those cities did not fall because the Seljuks were unstoppable, but because the gates were opened from within. Reports reached Romanos, whispers that certain commanders had abandoned their posts without a fight, retreating long before the enemy was in sight. At first, it sounded like cowardice, but the names of those commanders told a darker story. Several bore ties to the Doukas family, the same rivals who still simmered with resentment over his marriage to the empress. If the Seljuks were at the gates, it was because someone inside wanted them there. The realization was poison. Romanos was preparing to ride against the empire's greatest external threat, yet he could not trust the ground beneath his own feet. Still, to do nothing was to surrender the east without a fight, and surrender was not in his nature, so he made the decision. He would take the war to the Seljuks himself, lead the army into the heart of Anatolia, and force them to face him on open ground. It would be a campaign not only for territory, but for the soul of the empire itself. Because if Romanos could win, he might silence both the enemy beyond the border and the enemy within. The drums of war began to beat, and the empire turned its eyes eastward. Yet, beyond the horizon, the Seljuks were not the only ones watching his every move. The road to Manzikert was not paved with victory, but with dust, doubt, and something worse: silence. As Romanos led his forces eastward, the mountains loomed like watchers, and the valleys narrowed like traps. The land beneath their boots had once been imperial. Now it was contested, and every mile gained felt like a dare hurled at the empire's fading legacy. The army Romanos commanded was vast, but fractured. It was a patchwork of loyalties: soldiers from the western provinces, mercenaries from beyond the Danube, and elite tagmata from Constantinople. Each division marched under its own commander, and not all those commanders wished to see the emperor return alive. He thought he was leading an army. In truth, he was walking with ghosts, some loyal, some already digging his grave. At his side marched Andronikos Doukas, son of Caesar John Doukas, the very family Romanos had once humiliated by claiming the throne through marriage. To the men, Andronikos wore the empire's colors, but to those who knew, he carried a different banner, one stitched with bitterness, waiting to be unfurled. Supplies dwindled faster than expected. Messengers vanished. Scouting parties returned with conflicting reports. Seljuk movements that seemed to vanish into thin air. Cities rumored to be friendly, now eerily empty. The further they marched, the more it felt like someone was clearing the path, not for Romanos to win, but for him to be swallowed. The soldiers grumbled, but they obeyed. The emperor rode among them, armor dulled by travel, eyes fixed ahead. He did not show fear, not yet, but the silence around him was growing heavier. And then came the letter. A message from scouts near Lake Van. Sultan Alp Arslan was near, and his forces were not retreating as expected. They were waiting. Romanos saw in that moment what few in the court had believed possible. The Seljuks were not afraid of open war. They welcomed it. Still, he pushed forward, because to retreat would be to shatter the illusion of strength, because to hesitate would give his enemies, both foreign and domestic, exactly what they wanted. The imperial camp was established near the fortress of Manzikert. Banners rose, shields stacked, orders sent across the lines, and somewhere behind him, a man who wore the same crest as the emperor was already choosing which side of history he'd stand on. The morning of battle broke without glory. There were no fanfares, no shouts of triumph, only dust rising from the hooves of riders and the grim silence of men tightening straps and checking blades. The wind shifted westward, and with it came the scent of something not yet spoken, but already known. Romanos gave the order. The imperial army began its advance, slowly, methodically. Rows of archers, heavy infantry, cavalry units curling around the flanks like tightening fists. Ahead lay the Seljuk line, barely visible, scattered across the plains near Manzikert, like ghosts waiting to be summoned. The emperor expected resistance. Instead, he found space and stillness. Alp Arslan's forces appeared to retreat. It looked like panic, even fear, the kind of retreat that invites pursuit. Romanos took the bait. He pushed forward, believing the moment had come to strike the decisive blow. But with every step the Byzantine army took, the field grew wider, and the ranks grew thinner. Messages stopped flowing. Scouts didn't return. Units that were once behind him now seemed strangely distant. And then, at the height of advance, the flank buckled, not from Seljuk arrows, but from absence. The left wing, commanded by Andronikos Doukas, had turned back. No signal, no reason, no warning. One moment, Romanos held the battlefield. The next, he was standing in its center alone. From the east, the Seljuk cavalry surged back, not in retreat, but in encirclement. Their archers rode in wide loops, loosing arrows that rained down like iron dust. The Byzantine line collapsed inward, trapped between confusion and betrayal. Romanos fought. He stayed on the field long after other commanders vanished, his sword flashing beneath the imperial standard. He shouted until his voice gave out. He bled beside his men. But loyalty cannot shield against a blade that strikes from behind. As the sun dipped low, the emperor was surrounded. He did not fall to a warlord. He fell to a silence he never expected, the silence of allies who chose not to answer. The battlefield that night was littered with broken spears and bodies already stiffening under the stars. And somewhere in the dark, the emperor of Byzantium was taken, not killed, not yet, taken alive. He expected death. After all, emperors taken in battle do not return, they disappear. Their names vanish from coins, their legacy ends where the sword fell. But Romanos IV was not given that mercy. He was taken, not bound in chains, but in something far worse: uncertainty. The Seljuk soldiers who surrounded him did not jeer, they did not strike, they bowed, and they led him to Sultan Alp Arslan, not as a prisoner of war, but as a man worth negotiating with. What Romanos found was not a barbarian warlord, but a ruler who understood both humiliation and power. Alp Arslan received him seated calmly on a carpet beneath the open sky. There was no golden throne, no marble chamber, only the stark contrast between a victorious nomad and a fallen emperor. And yet, the Sultan did not gloat. He offered water. He spoke through interpreters, his words measured, his tone even. Romanos bowed, and when the Sultan asked him what he would do in his place, the emperor replied, "If I had won, I would have killed you." Alp Arslan smiled and chose not to do the same. The conqueror spared the defeated, not out of mercy, but calculation. They came to terms. The emperor would be ransomed. Lands would be ceded. A marriage alliance was suggested to bind peace in paper and blood. For a moment, Romanos believed he might return to Constantinople not in shame, but in strategy. He had been humbled, yes, but not yet broken. And when the Seljuks released him, he still wore the purple, still bore the title of Basilius. But the empire he was returning to was no longer the empire he had left. Because while Romanos was bowing before Alp Arslan, a new crown had already been forged in Constantinople, and it did not have his name on it. He expected resistance. He expected whispers, doubt, perhaps even scorn. What he did not expect was silence. When Romanos stepped back onto imperial soil, there were no banners waiting for him, no trumpets, no crowds, just wind, and the distant echo of something that had already been decided. News traveled faster than armies. By the time the emperor returned, a new emperor had already been crowned, Michael VII, son of Constantine X, puppet of the Doukas clan. The message was clear. Romanos had not returned as a ruler, but as a liability. The court he had once commanded now pretended he did not exist. His allies turned away. Doors that had once opened at his approach now closed before his shadow reached them. He tried to send letters. He tried to speak. But what do words matter when the ink is dry and the decisions have already been carved in stone? The throne was not taken with swords. It was taken with smiles, with sealed scrolls, with a quiet nod passed in a candlelit chamber. Romanos still had supporters, old loyalists, commanders in the provinces, men who remembered the dust of the eastern roads. They offered him protection, then troops, then hope. And for a brief moment, it seemed the empire would split itself in two. Two crowns, two emperors, one inevitable reckoning. But while Romanos gathered strength, his enemies prepared faster. The Doukas faction moved with precision, not just political maneuvering, but military. They painted him as a traitor, as the man who had lost Manzikert, as the one who had bowed before the Turks. In the eyes of the capital, Romanos was no longer a savior returning from war. He was the reason the war had been lost. He tried one last move, one final march to reclaim his name, his face, his crown. But the roads he once knew had changed, and this time, no one was clearing the way forward. He could have disappeared, faded into exile, become a footnote, the emperor who fell and was spared. But Romanos was not made for silence. Not when his name had once moved armies, not when the crown still burned behind his eyes. He rallied what remained, loyalists from Cappadocia, a handful of veterans who remembered his command not as failure, but as honor. It was not an army. It was a memory, marching on borrowed time. He was no longer fighting for the empire. He was fighting to prove he had ever belonged to it. His enemies, meanwhile, sharpened both sword and story. The court declared him a usurper, a man corrupted by foreign hands, a traitor who had sold dignity for survival. Andronikos Doukas, the same man who had abandoned him at Manzikert, now rode under the banner of justice. He led the forces of Michael VII with the full weight of imperial legitimacy behind him. The two armies met in the hills of Cilicia, but there was no great clash, no heroic stand. The men who followed Romanos fought hard, but they were outnumbered, out-equipped, outmaneuvered. By nightfall, the banners of the old emperor had been torn down, and the man who once ruled Constantinople stood surrounded, again. But this time, there would be no negotiation, no foreign sultan to offer grace. This time, it was his own country that held the blade. They took him not as a guest, not as a general, but as a warning. Stripped of command, stripped of armor, stripped of voice. They did not kill him, not yet. Because in Byzantium, there were worse things than death. They called it mercy. They said they would spare his life, but when mercy is spoken behind closed doors, it rarely comes without conditions. Romanos was taken to the monastery of Agia Anastasios, not far from the city that had once been his. He was not placed in a prison, but in a chamber lined with icons, candles flickering on cracked walls. A place of silence. A place for reflection, they said. But the guards never smiled, and the door never opened outward. What came next was not a sentence. It was a message carved into flesh. The Doukas court had decided Romanos would be blinded, not executed. That would have made him a martyr. Not exiled. That would have allowed him to speak. But blinded, so he could live in the dark, forgotten, erased from power, but still breathing. There was no trial. There was no priest. Only rope and heat. They burned iron. They held him down. And when the iron touched skin, the chamber did not echo with screams, because Romanos held them in. But his body twisted like a dying tree, and the monks turned their faces away. One eye failed first, then the second. And with them, the last light of the emperor's world disappeared. They left him there, barely conscious. No healer came. The wounds festered. Flies gathered. Days passed, or maybe hours. In the dark, time meant nothing. He had commanded legions. He had worn the purple. And now he could not see his own hands. They exiled him to the island of Prote. No entourage, no ceremony. Only the stink of the sea, the groan of old wood beneath his feet, and the sound of waves crashing against stone. Again, and again, and again. Once, Romanos IV had commanded one of the greatest empires in the world. He had worn the imperial purple, signed decrees with trembling hands of power, led armies into foreign dust. Men bowed before him. Crowds chanted his name. In the end, he died nameless. On a lonely island, blinded, infected, abandoned. There was no monument, no eulogy, only stone and silence. He lost more than a throne. He lost the right to be remembered. And perhaps that, more than the iron, more than the betrayal, is what broke him. Empires do not fall in a single day. They crack quietly, from within, when fear wins over loyalty and ambition poisons blood. And sometimes, the last thing an emperor sees is not the face of his enemy, but the betrayal of his own. If you've stayed with us through this story, thank you. Your time matters here. If you found this journey powerful, dark, or worth remembering, please like, subscribe, share it forward, and drop your thoughts below. We read them all. And if you crave more tales like this one, we invite you to explore the full playlist. Royal Blood and Tortures, the dark medieval tales. You'll find more stories of downfall, vengeance, and the silent cruelties of power. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember, sometimes history doesn't whisper, it screams.